The dust had not settled on Millbrook's main street for 3 years, not since the day Sheriff Marcus Thornfield put a bullet through the heart of the most feared outlaw the territory had ever known. Or so he thought. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered wooden buildings, painting the dirt roads in shades of amber and rust. Children played in the dusty streets, their laughter echoing off the false-fronted stores that lined the main thoroughfare. Women in calico dresses swept their porches, sending small clouds of dust dancing in the morning light. Men gathered outside Henderson's general store, discussing cattle prices and the upcoming harvest festival. It was a peaceful scene, the kind that made visitors think Millbrook was just another sleepy frontier town, where nothing exciting ever happened. They could not have been more wrong. Sheriff Marcus Thornfield sat in his office, badge catching the early light as it filtered through windows that had not seen a proper cleaning in months. The brass star on his chest bore the scratches and dents of 15 years of frontier law enforcement, or so the townspeople believed. They saw him as their protector, the man who had brought peace to their community by ridding them of the most dangerous outlaw the territory had ever known. But peace, like truth, is often built on foundations of sand, and on this particular morning those foundations were about to crumble. Thornfield was reviewing the monthly reports from his deputies when he heard it, the sound that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The slow, deliberate echo of spurs against weathered wood, each step measured, purposeful, like a clock counting down to Judgment Day. The sheriff looked up from his paperwork, pen frozen in his grip. Something about that sound made his blood run cold. It was not just the rhythm, though, that was distinctive enough. It was the weight behind each step, the confidence, the absolute certainty of purpose that spoke of a man who feared nothing because he had already lost everything. Thornfield had heard that sound before 3 years ago, on the day that had made him a hero in the eyes of Millbrook's citizens. The day he had faced down Ezekiel Blackwood in the middle of Main Street and put a bullet through the outlaw's heart. But that was impossible. Ezekiel Blackwood was dead. Thornfield had watched him fall, seen the blood pool in the dust, stood over the body as Dr. Morrison confirmed what everyone already knew. The most feared gunfighter in 3 territories was finally at peace in the ground. The footsteps stopped directly outside the sheriff's office. For a long moment, there was only silence. Not the comfortable quiet of a peaceful morning, but the heavy, expectant silence that comes before a thunderstorm. The kind of silence that makes horses nervous and dogs hide under porches. Then came the creak of old hinges, as the door swung open without so much as a courtesy knock. No announcement, no request for permission to enter. Just the weight of inevitability stepping across the threshold, like death itself paying a social call. And there he stood, Ezekiel Blackwood, the ghost of Millbrook, the dead man walking. But this was not the same man who had fallen in the street 3 years ago. The Ezekiel Blackwood that Thornfield remembered had been wild, unpredictable, driven by rage and desperation. This man carried himself with a different kind of power. His face bore new scars, deep lines carved by pain and something far worse than death. His eyes, once wild with outlaw fury, now held a cold intelligence that made Thornfield's blood turn to ice water in his veins. The years had changed him in ways that went beyond the physical. There was something about his presence that seemed to draw all the warmth from the room, something that made the very air feel heavy with unspoken threats and promises of retribution. Blackwood wore the same black coat he had died in, but now it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His gun belt hung low on his hips, the leather worn smooth by years of use, the ivory grips of his revolvers polished to a shine that caught the morning sun like captured lightning. Sheriff Thornfield's hand moved slowly toward his own weapon, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought had failed. But Blackwood raised a single finger, not in threat, but in a gesture that somehow commanded absolute attention, a gesture that said, "Wait, listen, learn what you have wrought." The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, each man studying the other, measuring intentions, calculating odds. Outside, the normal sounds of the town continued. Mrs. Patterson called to her chickens. The blacksmith's hammer rang against his anvil. Children laughed as they chased a stray dog down the street. But inside the sheriff's office, time seemed to have stopped altogether. "I reckon you thought you killed me, Marcus," Blackwood finally said. His voice like gravel poured over broken glass. The words carried weight, each syllable carefully chosen, precisely delivered. His accent had changed too, carrying hints of places far from this dusty frontier town, places where men learned to survive things worse than bullets, where death was just another teacher in the hard school of existence. Thornfield's throat worked, but no words came. He stared at the man he had shot, watched full, seen buried in the hill cemetery just outside town. The man whose death had made him a hero, earned him re-election 3 times running, brought peace to Millbrook for the first time in a decade. The impossibility of it struck him like a physical blow. Dead men did not walk into sheriff's offices to have conversations. Dead men did not carry themselves with the confidence of the living, did not speak with voices that carried the authority of absolute certainty. Yet here stood Ezekiel Blackwood, as real as the morning sun streaming through the windows, as solid as the wooden floor beneath his feet, as dangerous as the day Thornfield had gunned him down in the street. "Oh, you did kill me," Blackwood continued, stepping closer to the desk with movements that were somehow both graceful and threatening. "The man I was died that day, Marcus, died right there in the dirt of Main Street with half the town watching. But death, Sheriff, death taught me things, opened doors I never knew existed, showed me truths about this town, about you, about the nature of justice itself, that would make the devil himself weep for shame." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees with each word. Outside, a dog began howling, long and mournful, as if sensing something unnatural had entered their world. Other dogs picked up the sound until the entire town echoed with their lamentations. "You see, Marcus, when a man dies and comes back, he sees things differently. Time moves strange when you are caught between worlds, suspended in that grey place where the living and the dead meet to settle their accounts. I had plenty of opportunity to observe, to listen, to learn. And what I learned about you, about what really happened that day 3 years ago, about what you have been hiding all these years, well, that knowledge is going to cost you everything you have ever held dear." Blackwood reached into his coat, the movement deliberate and unhurried. Thornfield tensed, expecting a weapon, but instead the dead man produced a leather journal, worn and stained, its pages yellowed with age and filled with what looked like years of careful documentation. "This little book contains 15 years of secrets, Marcus. 15 years of lies, murder, and theft. 15 years of you playing the part of the honest lawman while robbing this town blind and killing anyone who got too close to the truth." He placed the journal on Thornfield's desk with the reverence one might show a holy book or a death warrant. The leather cover was scarred and burned in places, as if it had been through fire and somehow emerged intact. Thornfield finally found his voice, though it came out cracked and hollow like the call of a dying bird. "You are dead, Ezekiel. I put you in the ground myself, watched them throw dirt on your coffin, said words over your grave." Blackwood smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold promise of revelation and retribution, the satisfied expression of a man who held all the cards in a deadly game. "The coffin was empty, Sheriff. Has been for 3 years. Want to know where I have been? Want to know what I discovered while you were playing hero to these good people of Millbrook?" The outlaw opened the journal to the first page, revealing a photograph of Millbrook from 20 years ago. But this was not the Millbrook that Thornfield remembered, not the sleepy frontier town that struggled to survive in the harsh wilderness. This was a thriving mining community, rich with silver, bustling with prosperity and hope. In the photograph, the streets were paved with wooden planks. Electric lights illuminated the storefronts. Well-dressed men and women strolled the sidewalks, their faces bright with the confidence that came from living in a place where fortunes could be made and dreams could come true. The contrast with the current Millbrook was stark and painful. Where the photograph showed prosperity, the reality outside the sheriff's office was one of gradual decline. Businesses barely hanging on, families struggling to make ends meet, young people leaving as soon as they came of age because there was nothing left for them in their hometown. You remember the silver mine, do not you, Marcus? The one that made this town rich for nearly a decade? The one that supposedly played out 15 years ago, forcing half the population to leave, turning Millbrook from a boom town into the dying whisper it is today. Thornfield's face had gone pale as cemetery marble. His hands trembled as he stared at the photograph, at the prosperity that had been lost, at the prosperity that he knew had been stolen rather than simply vanishing into the earth. Blackwood turned the page, revealing documents, contracts, and surveys, all bearing official seals, all apparently legitimate, and all bearing Marcus Thornfield's signature. The dates went back 15 years, to the time when the mine had supposedly played out. The mine never played out, did it, Sheriff? The silver is still there, still being extracted, still making men rich. It just became inconvenient to have so many witnesses around, too many people who might ask uncomfortable questions about where all that silver really went in the middle of the night. Each page revealed more evidence, more proof of a conspiracy that ran deeper than anyone in Millbrook could have imagined. Bank records showing mysterious deposits into accounts under false names. Bills of sale for property purchased far from town, in places where a man could live like a king on stolen wealth. Correspondence with mining companies in San Francisco, Denver, and Chicago, places where a man could sell silver without awkward questions about its origin. But the most damning evidence came near the end of the journal, a contract, written in legalese but clear in its intent, signed in Thornfield's distinctive handwriting. A contract agreeing to protect certain mining operations in exchange for a substantial percentage of profits. A contract that required the elimination of any threats to the operation, any individuals who might expose the truth. A contract that named specific people who had begun asking too many questions about the mine's sudden closure. Names that included honest miners, territorial inspectors, and one mining engineer named Samuel Blackwood. The blood drained from Thornfield's face as he read his brother's name on the list. Samuel Blackwood, age 28, mining engineer, elimination priority, high. Samuel was not an outlaw, was he, Marcus? Blackwood's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than a shouted threat. He was a mining engineer, an honest man who had worked the Millbrook mine for 3 years before it supposedly played out. A man who knew exactly how much silver was still in those tunnels. A man who started asking questions about why the mine closed when there were veins rich enough to work for another decade. The truth hit Thornfield like a physical blow to the stomach. Samuel Blackwood had not died in a mining accident 15 years ago. As the official records claimed, he had been murdered to keep him quiet about the conspiracy. Murdered because he was honest, because he cared about the truth, because he threatened the profits of powerful men. And his brother Ezekiel had spent the last 15 years trying to prove it, building a case, gathering evidence, becoming an outlaw, not by choice but by necessity. When the law is corrupt, honest men are forced to work outside it. When Ezekiel finally came to Millbrook 3 years ago, it was not for robbery or random mayhem. He had come seeking justice for his brother's murder, carrying evidence that would have destroyed the conspiracy and restored the stolen wealth to the people of Millbrook. But Thornfield, protecting his own secrets and the secrets of his conspirators, had painted him as a dangerous criminal and shot him down in the street before he could reveal what he knew, except the bullet had not killed him. Not entirely. I spent 3 years in places that exist between life and death, Marcus. Places where men learn the true cost of betrayal, where the spirits of the murdered teach the living about justice. Where I discovered that my brother Samuel was not the only one you killed to protect your secret. Blackwood turned to another section of the journal, revealing more names, more photographs, more evidence of systematic murder. A dozen men and women who had worked the mine, who had known too much, who had died in convenient accidents over the years. There was Maria Santos, the bookkeeper who had noticed discrepancies in the mine's output records, found dead at the bottom of a ravine. Her death ruled an accident despite the fact that she was an experienced rider who had never fallen from a horse in her life. There was James Mitchell, the territorial inspector who had come to investigate reports of the mine's closure, found dead in his hotel room, apparently from a heart attack, though he was only 32 years old and in perfect health. There was Rebecca Walsh, the schoolteacher, who had asked too many questions about why the children of mining families were suddenly leaving town, found dead in her schoolhouse, apparently from a cooking fire that had gotten out of control, though neighbors reported that she never cooked in the building. A pattern of murder stretching back 15 years, all designed to protect the secret of the Millbrook mine. All sanctioned by Sheriff Marcus Thornfield in exchange for wealth beyond the dreams of an honest lawman. But the worst revelation was yet to come. You want to know the truly terrifying truth, Marcus? The thing that will destroy not just you, but this entire town when it comes to light. The silver mine is still producing, has been producing all these years. Every month men come in the dark of night and take out enough silver to make a dozen men rich. Silver that belongs to the people of Millbrook. Silver that could have saved this town, kept families together, prevented the slow death we see around us every day. Thornfield's world was crumbling around him like a house built on sand in a hurricane. Everything he had built, every lie he had told, every murder he had covered up or committed, all of it was written in that terrible journal with the precision of a court record and the finality of a death sentence. But where has all that silver gone, Marcus? Who has been buying it? Who has been getting rich while Millbrook slowly dies and families abandon their homes for lack of opportunity? The final pages of the journal contained the answer, and it was worse than Thornfield had ever imagined. Maps showing a network of mines across 3 states, all connected by a web of corruption that reached from local sheriffs to territorial governors to railroad barons to federal senators. The theft so massive, it had impoverished entire regions, while enriching a handful of powerful men who lived in mansions in San Francisco and New York, men who had never set foot in places like Millbrook, but who profited from their suffering nonetheless. And at the center of it all, like a spider in a web of greed and murder, was Sheriff Marcus Thornfield. Not just a corrupt lawman, but one of the architects of the greatest theft in frontier history. "The people of this town trusted you," Blackwood said, his voice carrying the weight of all the dead, all the betrayed, all the families whose futures had been stolen. "They believed you were protecting them from men like me. Instead, you were stealing their children's inheritance, murdering anyone who threatened your operation, letting them slowly starve while you grew rich on their birthright." Outside, storm clouds had gathered despite the clear morning sun. The wind began to howl through the streets of Millbrook, carrying with it the sound of approaching thunder. Or perhaps it was the sound of justice finally coming home after years of wandering in the wilderness. The temperature in the room continued to drop, and Thornfield noticed that his breath was beginning to fog. Ice crystals formed on the windows despite the summer heat outside. The very air seemed to thicken, becoming hard to breathe, heavy with the weight of accumulated guilt and approaching retribution. "Now, Marcus, you are going to make a choice," Blackwood continued, his scarred face inches from Thornfield's across the desk. "You can confess to these crimes, return the stolen silver, face the justice you have avoided for so long. You can try to make amends for the lives you have destroyed, the families you have ruined, the future you have stolen from this town. But that was not the worst of Blackwood's ultimatum. Or I can take this journal to the territorial governor, to the newspapers in Denver and San Francisco, to the federal marshals who are already investigating mining fraud across the territory. I can make sure that every detail of your crimes is published for the world to see. I can destroy not just you, but every corrupt official, every crooked businessman, every murderer who participated in this conspiracy." The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the windows, shaking the very foundations of the sheriff's office. But it was not just wind anymore. It was something else, something that had been awakened by 15 years of injustice, something that demanded satisfaction for crimes too long hidden. "There is one more thing you need to know, Sheriff, one final truth that will haunt you for whatever time you have left on this earth. The mine that you have been robbing all these years, the silver you have been stealing, it was never just about the money." Blackwood leaned forward, his eyes burning with an otherworldly light that seemed to come from some inner fire that death had not been able to extinguish. "The mine sits on sacred ground, Marcus, land that was taken from the Apache through treaties you helped forge, agreements you witnessed, documents you signed. Land that was supposed to be protected, kept safe, honored according to the old agreements between the government and the tribes." The revelation hit Thornfield like another physical blow. The Apache connection explained so much. The strange accidents that had plagued the mine even during its legitimate operation. The warnings that the tribal elders had given, warnings that had been ignored in the rush for silver and profit. Instead, you defiled it, stole from it, murdered for it, turned sacred burial grounds into sources of profit for men who care nothing for the spirits of the dead, nothing for the promises made to those who lived on this land for generations before the first white man ever saw these mountains. The wind outside became a howl, and with it came other sounds, voices speaking in languages that Thornfield did not recognize, chanting in rhythms that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to something deep in his soul, something that recognized guilt and demanded payment. The spirits of the dead do not rest easy. when their burial ground is violated for profit, Marcus. They do not forgive when their sacred places are turned into sources of greed. And they have been waiting all these years, waiting for someone to speak for them, to demand justice for their desecrated rest. As if summoned by Blackwood's words, shadows began to move in the corners of the room. Not natural shadows cast by objects in sunlight, but shapes that moved with purpose, with intelligence, with a hunger for retribution that had been building for 15 years. You feel them, do not you? The spirits of all those you murdered. Samuel, the other miners, the Apache whose land you defiled. They have been waiting for this day, Sheriff, the day when the truth finally comes home to roost. Thornfield tried to speak, tried to move, but found himself frozen in place by a terror that went beyond the physical. The temperature in the room had dropped so low that ice was forming on every surface. His breath came out in visible puffs that hung in the air like accusations. The shadows in the room grew darker, more substantial, taking on shapes that might once have been human. Faces began to emerge from the darkness, faces of men and women long dead, all staring at Thornfield with eyes that burned with the need for justice long denied. Samuel Blackwood's face was among them, young and earnest, just as he had been when Thornfield had arranged his murder 15 years ago, the face of a man who had died for the crime of being honest, of caring about truth more than profit. The murdered miners were there too, their faces bearing the marks of the accidents that had not been accidents, the cave-ins and explosions and poisonings that had silenced their questions and ended their lives. And behind them all, shapes that might have been Apache spirits, ancient guardians of the land that had been defiled, warriors and elders and children whose rest had been disturbed by greed and whose sacred places had been turned into sources of profit for their destroyers. "The choice is yours," Marcus, Blackwood said, standing up from the desk and gathering his journal. "But choose quickly. The dead are not patient. They have waited 15 years for justice. They will not wait much longer." Sheriff Thornfield looked around his office, at the badge on his chest that had become a symbol of corruption rather than justice, at the town outside his window that was dying because of his greed, at the ghosts of his victims who surrounded him with their silent accusations. Everything he had built was crumbling. Everything he had gained through murder and theft was turning to dust in his hands. The weight of 15 years of guilt pressed down on him like a mountain, threatening to crush what remained of his soul. His hand moved toward his gun one more time, not in threat but in desperation, in the hope that perhaps he could find in death the peace that had been denied to his victims. But the shadows moved faster, cold fingers wrapping around his wrist, holding it in place with a grip that felt like ice and iron. The voices of the dead began to whisper, a sound like wind through tombstones, like water over stones in a forgotten creek, like the last breaths of dying men. They spoke of betrayal and murder, of sacred ground defiled, of children orphaned and families destroyed, of a town slowly dying while its wealth was stolen. "I confess," Thornfield whispered, the words torn from his throat by fear and the weight of guilt too long carried. "I confess to all of it. The murders, the theft, the conspiracy. I confess to betraying the trust of the people who believed in me, to destroying the future of this town, to defiling sacred ground for profit." The shadows stopped moving. The whispers ceased. Even the wind outside grew still, as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting to see if justice would finally be served. Blackwood nodded slowly, his scarred face showing neither satisfaction nor mercy, only the grim acceptance of a man who had seen too much of both good and evil to take pleasure in either. "That is a beginning, Marcus, but confession is just the first step on a very long road. Now comes the hard part. Now you have to make it right." The outlaw who had returned from the dead gathered up his journal. The evidence of 15 years of corruption and murder, the proof that would either redeem or destroy not just Thornfield, but an entire network of powerful men who had grown rich on stolen silver and innocent blood. But as he moved toward the door, Thornfield called out, his voice breaking with desperation and something that might have been hope. "Ezekiel, wait. How did you survive? How did you come back from the dead? What happened to you in those 3 years?" Blackwood paused at the threshold, his hand on the door handle. He turned back one final time, and Thornfield saw something in his eyes that was both terrifying and strangely comforting, a depth of experience that spoke of journeys through realms that the living were not meant to see, of conversations with forces that existed beyond the boundaries of mortal understanding. I told you, Marcus. I went to places between life and death, places where justice never dies even when the body fails. The spirits of the murdered taught me that some wrongs are too great to rest in peace, that some truths are too important to stay buried in the ground with the bones of the innocent. He stepped out into the street, leaving Thornfield alone with his confession and the weight of 15 years of accumulated guilt. But the sheriff was not truly alone. The shadows remained watching, waiting, ensuring that justice would finally be served and that the dead would finally find the peace that had been denied them for so long. As Blackwood walked down the main street of Millbrook, the townspeople began to emerge from their buildings. Somehow they knew that something fundamental had changed in their world. Perhaps it was the strange events of the morning, the unnatural storm, the feeling that the very air was charged with possibility and retribution. Or perhaps it was simply time. Time for the truth to finally see the light of day. Time for the stolen silver to be returned to its rightful owners. Time for the dead to finally rest in peace and for the living to reclaim their stolen future. The outlaw who had returned from the grave walked toward the old mining office where the records of the conspiracy were kept, where the evidence of 15 years of theft and murder waited to be revealed to the world. Behind him, Sheriff Marcus Thornfield sat in his office, writing his full confession, guided by the whispers of the dead and the weight of a guilt that had finally become too heavy to bear. And in the hills above Millbrook, the sacred burial ground that had been defiled for profit began to heal, as justice, long delayed, finally came home to the frontier town that had lost its way in greed and murder and was now ready to find its way back to the light. The truth was indeed terrifying, but sometimes terror is the price of redemption. Sometimes the dead must return to teach the living about the cost of betrayal. And sometimes, justice delayed becomes justice delivered by forces beyond the understanding of mortal men, forces that remember every wrong and demand payment for every crime. In Millbrook, on that strange morning when an outlaw returned from the grave, the truth finally set them free. Even if freedom came at a price that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their days, it was a price worth paying for the chance to build something better on the ruins of corruption and lies.